The dovetail joint has been used as far back as the ancient Egyptians. It's also probably the quintessential joint in woodworking. It's also probably one of the most intimidating joints in woodworking. That's why there are hundreds, if not thousands, of videos on YouTube about how to cut a dovetail joint. And I've watched a lot of them. I've, for the most part, used Rob Cosman's method when I cut a full through dovetail joint. I've always been intimidated by the half-blind dovetail joint for some reason. And there comes a time when you probably are going to need to cut a half-blind dovetail joint. In the past, I've usually cheated by cutting a full through dovetail joint and then marrying on a front to the drawer to cover that up. That's just not going to work on the project this time. So I'm going to cut half-blind dovetail joint. This is going to be my first one. So I'll walk you through how I'm going to do it. I've kind of taken a number of different methods and kind of married them all together. Some things work really well. Yeah, the others are just a bit of trial and error. I think the two things that you have to remember when you're cutting a dovetail joint is, over those thousands of years, there's been millions of people cutting dovetail joints, and if they can do it, so can you. It may take a little more practice, but we are going to find ways to hog out the material that needs to be done, and take our time trimming up to the point where they fit. Just remember, you don't have to make it fit on the first try. After long experience, probably you can, but right now, I'm just worried about making a good fit. So if I have to sneak up on the joint, that's what I'm going to do. I think that's the way to take your first steps at these things. So stick around, watch while I do this, see where I make mistakes, make fun of me if you want, but this is my first one, and maybe this will inspire you to go ahead and cut your first half-blind dovetail joint.
First, I get the boards milled to proper dimensions, and then I use a hand plane to clean up any machine marks and make any adjustments to the width of the board that's needed. It's important that the end of the board is very square, so I like to use a shooting plane, but you can do this with a machine, a table saw or something like that if you're comfortable with that. The shooting board allows you to make very small adjustments though. Then I'll take my marking gauge and set it for the thickness of the sides, and then I can mark the inside of the board so I always know which side I'm working from, and then I'll mark that thickness of the sides on each end to work from as marking my dovetails. Now this drawer I'm making is an addition to an antique piece. So for continuity, I'm trying to make the pins about the same dimensions as the original. Not really that important, but it just seemed like the right thing to do. And this drawer is going to have two tails, so I'm marking those out first, and then using a dovetail marking guide to mark the angles of the dovetails. Now you may be wondering why I'm using a pencil rather than a marking knife to mark these angles. Keep in mind that this is the part that I'm going to fit to, so wherever this is, it's going to match, the other has to match it. Now I'm marking this off from the back side for the blind part of the dovetail. And then we'll draw those lines straight down so that I know where that is from the back side. And of course, it's always a good idea to mark out the waist pieces on both the top and the side. I'm going to set my router for that same depth as I just marked on the end. I'll double check it by eye to make sure it's close. And then I'm going to use the side of the drawer as a stop to keep the router from ever moving in too far. Then I'll use the router freehand to route out the bulk of that cavity for the tail to fit in. I'm using the router only to hog out the bulk of that waist area. And then I'm going to use hand tools to get into the tightness. So I'll use a dovetail saw to saw up to the line, and then a series of chisels to trim that back to exactly the way I want it and clean out all the corners. It'll take different angles and different size chisels. I also use a fishtail style chisel to get back into the corners. Now, since that front piece is only about 1/8 of an inch thick, I'm going to put a piece of scrap behind that to kind of support that and make sure I don't damage that front piece any. Here's that fishtail chisel that allows me to get right into the corners. And of course I might have to lay it down sometimes to get it from the top and tweak into the very last bit. I didn't take that router clear up to that just so that I could get it exactly where I wanted it to be. Now I'm going to match those up. You can see the mark on the outside of the side so I can make sure I keep those oriented the way I want it. Now I'm going to use some masking tape that I'm laying exactly along that front piece so that when I go to mark the tail or the tails, I can hold that as a little ledge right up against the edge of the side. That'll make sense here in a minute. I'm using the marking gauge at that same depth, and I'm going to mark the sides all the way around, all 4 sides. Now I'm going to lay or stand that front up against the board. Make sure it's even in the edges, and I'm going to use a square to kind of help me hold that steady. And using a marking knife, I'll get in there and mark all the end pieces. The marking knife gets in there precisely, but I am going to use a pencil to kind of help see those lines. And once again, marking off the waist pieces. Now I'll continue those lines across the end with a saddle square. And I'll use a chisel to cut in a little trough there for my for my saw. And we can begin sawing out the end where the pins will be. It is always easier to clamp the board at an angle so that you can saw perpendicular rather than trying to saw at an angle. Now I get the center pin cut. First with the dovetail saw. And then using a fret saw to cut out that waist. Then I'll go to the chisel to bring in right up to that line. Chisel in about halfway and flip the board over and chisel from the other side to prevent any kind of blowout on the back side. And sometimes I have to get in there with the chisel by hand and cut out that very end corner. That's a little tricky to get out of there sometimes. Then I like to chamfer off the inside of those dovetails, both the very end and then the edges. This will help make it fit in a little bit easier. Of course, I don't really expect to fit the first time, so I have to clean out a little bit more. So you have a nice fit. Now I'll use a 1/4-inch spiral bit, router bit to cut a slot in the bottom to hold the bottom of the drawer. And that'll go on the face and the two sides. And then for the back of the drawer, which only goes down to the slot, I like to just cut in a small rabbet. Not real deep, just enough for that back to register on. And we'll get this glued up. I use hide glue for the joints of the drawer, so in case the drawer ever needs to be disassembled. It also is a little slick, so it's nice when fitting the joint together. I'm a big fan of hide glue. We'll tap this together a little bit. And get the other side glued. The bottom is just a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. And then the back is just a piece of 3/4-inch shelving. And as you can see, it's marked up. It's a piece of scrap from another project. And yes, I am gluing to the end of the board, so the end grain is going to be part of the glue joint. I've done this many times, never had a problem with it. The back of the drawer isn't an area that gets a lot of stress, so it'll hold pretty well. If you're concerned about it, you can always put some dowels into the side or some other kind of joinery. Traditionally, a lot of drawers are made with dovetails in the back as well, but I just don't tend to do that. I'm lazy, I guess. So here I'm checking for square by measuring the diagonals. It was a little bit off, so I tried to check to see if it was both sides or just one side. If there was another issue. And it was just completely a little bit cranked, so I just squeezed it over and that worked. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take some double-sided tape and glue on some blocks directly to the tails. And this will, when I clamp that, that'll allow the clamps to put pressure only on the tails and not on the pins. So if there's any of the pins that are sticking out a little bit, this will allow me to get a good clamp and avoid those from holding it out. And when it's all dry, they can just get knocked off real easy. Oh, so the next morning I came in and took off the clamps. You can see how easy those blocks are to pull off. Now I'll clean up the sides with the plane, make everything even and smooth. Now, one of the things I did on this drawer was I made two little tills to set inside the drawer. This is kind of a dresser, and I figured it would give a little bit more for glasses or jewelry or whatever. I'm sizing in the boards that are going to hold that till up about 2 inches off the bottom. And then you can see how they'll set in there. Now what I did here was I used some wallpaper to dress up the bottom of the drawer. I also used this wallpaper in the bottom of the tills. All I did was use some spray adhesive. This is a real good quality heavy wallpaper, so it was a breeze to get it to stick down. Pleasure to work with. And we used an old membership card as a squeegee to flatten it all out. Then trim it up. Now, to hold the bottom in place, I'm going to put one screw in the center into the back of the drawer, and that'll hold it in place.
Okay, we're all done. This is my completed drawer. First one with a half blind dovetail joint. I'm very pleased with the way it turned out. It is probably not perfect, but for me, I'm right pleased with my first one. The drawer, all in all, is finished. You can watch the video as soon as it comes out on the dresser, and you can see how I did the rest of this. The sides still need to be stained, and I'm probably going to put dowels in the end back here just to give that rear piece a little more stability. So I hope you learned something. If not, maybe you got a good laugh, but thanks for watching and thanks for stopping by.